Jimmy Corsetti is a YouTuber and pseudo-archaeologist who promotes so-called alternative history narratives and argues against the conclusions of mainstream professional archaeologists. He believes Atlantis was a real historical site, which he locates in the Sahara Desert. He believes ancient civilizations had complex technology over 10,000 years ago. He believes the pyramids were, quote, certainly not tombs, end quote, and were built using, quote, a lost ancient technology that's beyond our current understanding, end quote. Jimmy also promotes conspiracy theories of various kinds, mostly about archaeology and history, and some about modern and current events. He even refers to himself as a conspiracy theorist. In this video, we'll see how Jimmy promoted a conspiracy theory that trees had been planted at the ancient archaeological site Gobekli Tepe in Turkey in order to conceal its ancient remains and prevent its excavation. We'll also see him disputing statements of fact made by archaeologists, insisting for months that the archaeologists were wrong, then later changing his own argument to agree with them, without acknowledging that he had spent months misinforming his audience and was slow to catch up with the truth. Jimmy's original Gobekli Tepe conspiracy. Gobekli Tepe is an archaeological site in Turkey with evidence of human building during at least 8 chronological eras, ranging from the modern to the Neolithic, which were originally categorized into 3 layers. The most significant findings at the site are the very large stone structures found at layers 2 and 3, constructed between 9,000 and 10,000 years ago and buried around 10 meters below the site surface. On the 11th of June 2024, Jimmy uploaded a video to his YouTube channel in which he showed photos of olive trees which had been planted on the Gobekli Tepe site, asking, quote, "Do any ancient ruins lie underneath these orchards? I mean, that is a sincere question, as I do not know if that is the case or not," end quote. In this video, he attributed the planting of the trees to a conspiracy theory, claiming, quote, "The tentacles of the World Economic Forum has seemingly infiltrated the world's oldest and most mysterious structure in all of human history," end quote, implying the World Economic Forum had planted the trees to cover up the site and prevent its excavation, further claiming, quote, "Members of the World Economic Forum are the ones making decisions here. If they wanted to dig it up, they would," end quote. On the same day, he tweeted, quote, "Were trees orchards planted over buried ancient ruins at Gobekli Tepe? Look at before-after pictures. 1. This would prevent excavation. 2. Tree roots can be very destructive," end quote. He also tweeted, quote, "Sinister powers are preventing excavations at the most important ancient site on Earth. Free Gobekli Tepe," end quote. The next day, Jimmy repeated his conspiracy theory in even stronger terms, writing, quote, "How the World Economic Forum, WEF, infiltrated Gobekli Tepe and are obstructing full excavation. This explains why only around 5% has been excavated and will be delayed for future generations," end quote. You might have already guessed that Jimmy has a habit of writing clickbait tweets and YouTube video titles with scaremongering and sensationalist language. But the important point to note here is his explicit conspiratorial claim that the World Economic Forum had, quote, "infiltrated Gobekli Tepe," end quote, and was, quote, "obstructing full excavation," end quote. Another Twitter user told him the trees had been planted by local farmers, saying, quote, "It was still some guy's farm. Why are you denying this? There's no conspiracy here," end quote. Jimmy responded by defending his conspiracy theory, saying, quote, "Some guy's farm? No, there were no previous crops planted on top of Gobekli Tepe," end quote. Archaeologist Dr. Oliver Dietrich, who has worked on the Gobekli Tepe site since 2005, responded to Jimmy, correcting him further, explaining that the trees had not yet been removed, quote, "because they stand in areas with over 1 meter of rubble above archaeological structures," end quote, adding, quote, "The roots are preventing erosion, thus in fact protecting the archaeology. If you wanted to know whether excavations are planned in these areas, ask the project staff," end quote. Jimmy replied, quote, "There are no plans to remove these trees and excavate what's buried under them. If you're saying that's false, please prove otherwise with a source, which includes dates for the pending dig," end quote. This is the earliest date I could find on which Jimmy made the claim that there were no plans to remove the trees or excavate what was beneath them. However, Jimmy still insisted on his conspiracy theory that the trees had not been planted by the local landowner and had instead been planted to prevent excavation, writing, quote, "Regardless, these trees would not have been planted if there was any plan to excavate this site in the foreseeable future. Those areas could be under excavation right now if the Dogus group chose to," end quote. For the next few months, Jimmy would continue to deny the trees had been planted by a local landowner and assert there were no plans for their removal in order to defend his conspiracy theory that the trees had been planted to prevent excavation. This was contradicted directly by an article on the Hurriyet Daily News website on the 1st of August 2024, commenting on the planting of the olive trees at Gobekli Tepe, stating that the head of the excavation, quote, "has denied recent reports which surfaced in both Turkish and international media that operations at the Neolithic site had ceased and that trees had been planted in the protected area," end quote. The article quoted excavation head Nekbi Karo saying, quote, "Yes, there are olive trees in the area, but they are not new," end quote, adding, quote, "There are attempts to create a perception that Gobekli Tepe excavations have been halted. These allegations are completely unfounded," end quote. This was a direct contradiction of Jimmy's claim that the trees had not been planted by a local landowner, but by the organization controlling the archaeological dig in order to prevent further excavation. Nevertheless, on August the 24th, Jimmy tweeted, quote, "The Gobekli Tepe conspiracy is real," end quote, linking to a video in which he continued to assert his conspiracy theory. Beneath the video, he made a comment, which he pinned, in which he promoted the conspiracy explicitly, stating, quote, "Why are they deferring a full excavation for future generations? Are they hiding something?" End quote. Many comments beneath the video demonstrated complete acceptance of Jimmy's conspiracy theory to conceal the site. 1. Quote, "The World Economic Forum is one of the greatest institutional threats to humanity," end quote. 2. Quote, "The past was erased, the erasure was forgotten, the lie became the truth. George Orwell," end quote. 3. "They definitely found something they don't want to be public," end quote. 4. Quote, "They're keeping us ignorant about human history for a reason," end quote. Those are just 4 comments out of hundreds saying the same thing. Many more such comments can be found on Twitter, such as the one on screen now, which claims, quote, "They've literally planted trees on top of the site, so no further excavation can happen," end quote, adding, quote, "It's been 7 years with no further excavation," end quote. It is noteworthy that Jimmy never attempted to tell these people that they were wrong, that he didn't really mean the trees were part of a conspiracy, he didn't really mean the trees had been planted to conceal the remains and prevent excavation, he didn't really mean the World Economic Forum was responsible for concealing the archaeological remains, he didn't really mean the presence of the trees showed there was no plan to fully excavate the site. On the contrary, in his video, Jimmy claimed the planting of the trees, quote, "only further validates that there is no intention for the foreseeable future to fully excavate this site, as they would have to cut them all down to do so," end quote, and completely dismissed the fact that the trees were not planted for conspiratorial reasons, but by landowners wishing to make money, commenting, quote, "Although Dr. Carroll explains that it was the landowners themselves that planted the trees, the reason behind it also makes no sense, as he claims that it was in order to increase the value of the land," end quote. Jimmy then showed he had no understanding of why the olive trees would increase the land's value, saying, quote, "Are we really going to pretend that planting olive trees at the world's oldest and most mysterious ancient site is going to increase the value in any way? The land is already priceless," end quote. He did not understand that at the time the trees were planted, this land was not owned by the government or controlled by the WEF or the Dogus Group, nor managed by archaeologists. The government had to expropriate the land from the private owners, and in order to do that, it had to pay the owners compensation. The owners, knowing this full well, deliberately planted the olive trees in order to increase the land's commercial value, ensuring the government would have to make a higher expropriation payment. Even then, the owners later complained, in an Instagram post on the 12th of February 2025, that the government's compensation had been below market value. But note their complaint was about the market value of the land, not its cultural value. They weren't expecting to be paid millions of dollars for culturally priceless land. This is one of several reasons why Jimmy is an unreliable source. He makes bold and inaccurate statements about subjects he simply does not know anything about. Interestingly, a post on the R Alternative History subreddit on the 20th August 2022 by a self-described local tour guide stated that Klaus Schmidt, an archaeologist in charge of excavations at Gobekli Tepe until his death in 2014, quote, planted so many olive trees to support both owners and the excavations, end quote. This probably doesn't mean Klaus was personally planting the trees, but that he supported the locals who were planting the trees. It's noteworthy that this person claims Klaus was in support of the tree planting to support the excavations, which may have been a reference to the tree's ability to prevent soil erosion. But at the very least, if this report is true, then the trees were not planted to conceal or damage the site or to prevent its excavation, but to support it. Jimmy is corrected by archaeologists. From the 11th of June 2024, Jimmy had been spreading his conspiracy theory that trees had been planted on Gobekli Tepe in order to prevent its further excavation due to archaeologists wishing to conceal historical facts. Meanwhile, on the 23rd of August 2024, a day before Jimmy's latest conspiratorial video making this claim, archaeologist Flint Dibble published a video interview with Dr. Lee Clare, field director at Gobekli Tepe, in which important facts about the olive trees were discussed. Flint commented, quote, so another thing that's come up on Twitter lately is kind of these olive trees that have been planted. I mean, from looking at them, I would think that having olive trees planted would help limit erosion. You know, sort of trees trap soil. On different sites, I've seen trees there to help limit erosion, provide shade, etc. Lee then explained, quote, I mean, there's a bit of a long history to these trees. I mean, the trees were actually planted back in 2006, I believe. And of course, that was before the site was actually purchased by the Turkish state. And before that, of course, it was farmland. Yeah, and the farmers, they were farming it. And in 2006, they planted these olive trees, which are still there today, end quote. Note that this is the site field director confirming what Jimmy had already been told all the way back on the 12th of June 2024, that the trees had been planted by local farmers. Remember, Jimmy was still denying this at this time and would continue to deny it for some months to come. Flint was sharing accurate information on the trees, while Jimmy was spreading falsehoods with his conspiracy theory. Lee agreed with Flint that the olive trees, quote, do in a way help hold the soil, end quote, preventing erosion, but added, quote, they're being constantly monitored to make sure they're not causing damage to the underlying features, end quote. This was clear evidence that the olive tree's potential danger to the site was well recognized by archaeologists and was being observed in order to avoid damage. It's also notable that Lee mentioned some of the trees had already been removed, which Jimmy never mentioned, most likely because he simply did not know. A day after his conspiratorial video about the olive trees, Jimmy tweeted, quote, remember the hundreds of olive trees planted on top of ancient ruins at Gobekli Tepe? Not only is it preventing excavation, their roots may destroy the ruins beneath, but get this, it's illegal to cut down olive trees in Turkey. The Olive Law 3573. This is a cover-up, end quote. The relevant law is Law number 3573 on olive improvement and grafting of wild species, which does indeed state, quote, the uprooting of olive trees in these areas is subject to the permission of the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs based on scientific justification, end quote. And, quote, olive trees cannot be cut or uprooted unless absolutely necessary, end quote, specifying fines for violations of the law. However, Jimmy used this to continue pushing his conspiracy theory, tweeting, quote, they specifically planted olive trees knowing they cannot be cut down, end quote. Note that this is Jimmy claiming explicitly that the olive trees had been planted deliberately to prevent excavation. Of course, this wasn't true, Jimmy just made it up, but his followers believed it and didn't bother fact-checking him. At this point, Jimmy had already been told who really planted the olive trees and why back on the 12th of June, but had steadfastly refused to accept the fact and was still denying it. On the 4th of September 2024, Jimmy repeated his conspiracy, retweeting a video from a visitor to Gobekli Tepe, which Jimmy claimed showed trees, quote, literally right in the middle of ancient ruins, end quote. His followers understood very well what Jimmy was saying, with one tweeting, quote, using the root systems of trees is a very clever way to destroy whatever lies beneath the surface. The people in charge of this site knew exactly what they were doing. Gobekli Tepe is the biggest cover-up in history. Something happened here they don't want us to know about, end quote. Another tweeted, quote, they must have discovered evidence of an ancient advanced civilization influencing the people who built this. That is the only reason for doing this. All their other excuses are totally illogical. That must be the reason, end quote. A third wrote, quote, need to reconstruct what is known about the site, at least as a digital model. There is obviously more to the site if this much effort has been made to cover it up, end quote. Again, Jimmy made no attempt to correct or moderate these people. While Jimmy was retweeting the photos and video which he claimed showed trees, quote, literally right in the middle of ancient ruins, end quote, several archaeologists were correcting him. Archaeologist Adam Morgan Ibbotson commented on some of the photos, disputing the claim that the stones shown were ancient ruins, writing, quote, 99% sure that's a natural limestone pavement. It can sometimes resemble archaeology or have archaeology on top, but it's impossible for it to be underneath it, end quote. Frank Logala, the visitor to Gobekli Tepe who had taken the photos, responded, saying, quote, I'm 99% sure you're not correct. You can literally see the outline of the structures as you walk around the site. Here's another angle. Buildings and walls are literally sticking out of the ground. I visited more than just this site, so my eyes are not untrained, end quote. However, Adam pointed out, quote, that's not the same place you originally posted. The earlier clip was almost certainly natural limestone, but this is dry stone wall. With my trained eye, I can tell the difference, end quote. Archaeologist Paul Barford also corrected Jimmy, writing, quote, I suggest doing some research. You can easily locate these stone blocks on Google Earth, end quote, explaining that the stone blocks among the trees which Jimmy asserted were ancient ruins on the Gobekli Tepe site were in fact in the area of the car park, not on the excavated tell, the archaeological mound site itself. Paul helpfully made further comments on these structures, noting, quote, some of them, as can easily be confirmed, come from modern farm buildings and field walls predating the excavations and laying out of the site as a monument, end quote, adding that these remains had been documented in the area by archaeologists all the way back in the 1960s. When a random tourist can't tell the difference between 10,000-year-old monolithic structures on the one hand and modern farm buildings on the other, you should pay less attention to the tourist and more attention to what professional archaeologists say instead. Archaeologist Justine Warren followed up with a link to the scholarly publication in which these structures had been documented and a screenshot from the work. Paul also provided a Google Earth screenshot, writing, quote, but in earlier Google Earth time-slice photos, you can see that precisely where these stones are was a modern farmstead earlier than 2004, enclosed with a stone wall. Google Street View shows incorporating large, rough limestone blocks, and exactly on that site stood a modern farm building, end quote. So Jimmy was sharing photos which he claimed showed trees planted on ancient ruins on the Gobekli Tepe site, when in fact the photos and videos were of areas near the car park, not on the excavated site, and the structures shown were natural limestone formations and the remains of modern-era farm buildings and field walls. Jimmy didn't realize this because he didn't know enough to understand what he was looking at and didn't do anything to check the facts before expressing his opinion. As we've seen, several archaeologists posted their corrections of Jimmy's claims, but Jimmy didn't respond to any of them. This is a recurring pattern of behavior with Jimmy. He makes false claims about subjects he doesn't know about, he's corrected conclusively by professionals in the field, and he simply ignores the corrections either by attempting to change the subject to something else or just not replying at all. This is another reason why he's simply unreliable. Meanwhile, Jimmy kept sharing the videos which had already been explained, with comments on the 5th of September such as, quote, "Another view of a tree planted on top of ancient ruins at Gobekli Tepe. This goes far beyond incompetence. The tree roots will destroy the ruins. Where is the outrage from archaeologists?" End quote. In response to this, Turkish Twitter user Okan Çelik explained, quote, "The trees were planted by the landowner to increase the expropriation price. He openly said so. The excavation continues and the authorities are already working to have the trees removed." End quote. Remember, Jimmy had been told this all the way back in June of 2004, several months earlier, and he had insisted it was false. On this occasion, Jimmy didn't directly contest the statement, but didn't openly accept it either, simply commenting, quote, "Let's see just one photo of just one tree being removed. I'll wait." End quote. In response, Okan stated, quote, "I don't know when or if it will happen." In a recent interview, Professor Nekmi Karol, who is the head of the excavation, said that they were already talking to the ministry for the removal. He also confirmed that the excavation started in May and would continue until October this year. End quote. It's important to note that this tweet provided Jimmy with evidence that the archaeologists working on the site were not only aware of the trees, but were already preparing for their removal. Jimmy did not respond to this tweet at all. Remember that all the way back in August, Dr. Lee Clare had told Flint Dibble that the trees were being monitored as a potential danger to any archaeological remains. Jimmy had been completely unaware of this and was instead still pushing his conspiracy theory that the trees had been planted to prevent the site being excavated. The comments from Okan provided further evidence that Lee was correct, and also provided evidence that the removal of the trees had already been planned. Again, Jimmy was totally unaware of any of this. Jimmy abandons his conspiracy claim. From the 11th of June 2024, Jimmy had been spreading his conspiracy theory that trees had been planted on Gobekli Tepe in order to prevent its further excavation due to archaeologists wishing to conceal historical facts. As early as the 12th of June, he was told this was false and that the trees had been planted by local landowners, and he was told this again on the 5th of September, but he continued to deny this was true. Meanwhile, from at least August 2024, Flint Dibble had been sharing the correct information that the trees were not planted due to any conspiracy, that they had been planted by local landowners, that archaeologists were aware of them, and their potential to damage the site was being monitored. But this suddenly changed, at least as early as the 20th of November 2024, though possibly earlier, when Jimmy was interviewed on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast with Dan Richards, a self-described pseudo-archaeologist and alternate historian. On the podcast, Jimmy completely abandoned his previous conspiracy claim that the olive trees had been built to conceal the site and prevent its excavation, instead saying, quote, "So when this was a property owned by farmers, and the Turkish government wanted to purchase the land from them, and the owners felt that they were being lowballed. So what they did was they planted olive trees on top of the site in order to increase the value of the land." End quote. Remember, Jimmy had spent months denying this was true. However, in the podcast, he didn't tell his audience this at all. The closest he came was to say, quote, "When I first heard of this, I'm like, I don't understand. This doesn't make sense to me. Gobekli Tepe is already priceless." End quote. But he didn't explain that he had been told this repeatedly by other people since June 2024 and had persistently denied it. Jimmy went on to explain that the olive trees which had been planted were protected by law, saying, quote, "It's called the Olive Law in Turkey in the 1930s, where it's illegal to cut down olive trees in Turkey. So I am like, well, that's interesting," end quote, all of which other people had told him months before. And then he dropped the subject. He certainly did not tell his podcast audience that he had been insisting for months that the trees were planted to conceal the site and prevent its excavation, and that he had been rejecting the facts by those who corrected him. On the 12th of February 2025, in response to a tweet from one of his followers asking why the trees had been planted in the first place and suggesting they had been planted to prevent soil erosion, Jimmy replied, quote, "The trees were planted to increase expropriation money to be paid to the landowners. It had nothing to do with preserving the soil. And besides, Gobekli Tepe was preserved just fine naturally for nearly 12,000 years as it was. They're now relocating the trees because the roots would or were damaging the ruins below, as I've long said." Below is an article posted yesterday quoting Nekmi Karo, end quote. Again, note he made absolutely no mention that he had been denying these facts for months, that several people had attempted to correct him, and that he was now accepting the view which mainstream archaeologists had rightly been stating during the entire time that he was spreading his conspiracy theory. That's not a lie, but it is the kind of omission of significant facts which people like Dan Richards, who was on the podcast with him, has characterized as an intellectually dishonest omission. This is just another reason not to trust Jimmy. We will see throughout this video, and in later videos, that Jimmy is typically very late to finding out information, which he usually picks up from people who correct his statements, then later represent these facts as his own findings. We'll also see Jimmy claiming he was the first to mention the potential damage the trees could cause to the site, despite the fact that archaeologists had not only mentioned this years before he did, but had planned as early as 2016 to remove any which damaged the site, and as early as 2017 to remove all of them. Before we leave this section, it's also worth noting Jimmy's tweet on the 12th of February 2025, citing Nekmi Karo as a reliable source for the information that the olive trees were originally planted by the landowners to increase their expropriation payment, and for the information that the tree roots were, quote, damaging the ruins below, end quote. This is of interest because just over a month later, on the 19th of March, Jimmy would insist that Nekmi was completely unreliable, calling him, quote, a known liar, end quote, and claiming he, quote, doesn't even physically work the site, end quote. So in February, Jimmy quoted Nekmi as an entirely reliable source, but in the following month, he was now an unreliable liar. Jimmy's attitude to sources of information can change dramatically according to whether or not they agree with him at any particular time. Why Jimmy Corsetti is unreliable. Jimmy never does any real archaeology. He mainly looks at photos and videos of Gobekli Tepe and makes unsubstantiated conspiracy claims about them. He has visited Gobekli Tepe in person, but hasn't ever used the opportunity to do even amateur archaeology or offer his services as a volunteer to the excavation team. Instead, he just takes photos and video to fuel his conspiratorial tweets and YouTube videos with more conspiratorial assertions. If Jimmy was genuinely interested in archaeology and helping people understand Gobekli Tepe, he could take one of the many scholarly articles written over the last decade and read or summarize it for his audience, explaining what it says and even commenting on how and in what way he agrees or disagrees with it. Archaeologists have published hundreds of pages of such research, but he doesn't do this. The closest I've seen him doing anything like this was back in 2017 with 2 videos I'll look at later on in another of my own videos. Of course, it would be very confusing for his audience if he did, since he is constantly telling them that archaeologists aren't interested in investigating the site and are either attempting to cover it up or destroy it in various ways. We've seen in this video how Jimmy was insistent on a conspiracy theory which had absolutely no basis in fact. We've seen how he persisted in maintaining this conspiracy theory in the face of repeated correction over months by real archaeologists. We've also seen how he finally caught up to the facts about 5 months later, dropping his original conspiracy theory without ever acknowledging he had been totally wrong about it. That's a good reason why you should trust real archaeologists over Jimmy. Even when he finally ends up saying something correct, he's typically one of the last to accept the facts. When he eventually turns around and starts repeating what archaeologists have been saying all along, despite having previously spent months claiming they were wrong, he doesn't even tell his audience that he was misleading them during the whole time the archaeologists were stating the truth. In the next few videos, we'll see repeated examples of this, and you can decide for yourself if I'm right to advise you that Jimmy Corsetti is unreliable.